congressman in Washington who the lobbyists don't even bother to visit.
This was an opportunity
There's one congressman in Washington whose refusal to compromise is legendary. My father, Ron Paul.
And well in Texas.
Oh yeah! Oh yeah! I'm a boy, Ron!
Georgia! Glad to see so much support out here for Ted, and it looks like he has a lot of momentum. And Rand, let me tell you, needs lots of help. So send him the help that he needs. But you know, we've talked a lot about the Senate race, but you know there's a still ongoing presidential race in this country. Matter of fact, we're still counting the votes. Matter of fact, we're just starting to count the delegates.
President Paul! Just one name!
And there's been many times that we've been written off, but on occasion now, almost like every day, there is another state that goes our way. But it may turn out that we will be the actual winners of Iowa. We're winning a lot of these delegates that were written off in the past, but we're winning a lot of other things too, putting people in the right place, becoming chairman of the Republican Party in the various states. So the revolution is working. We have infiltrated the Republican Party, and we will convert the Republican Party into the fingers of liberty. Supposed to write the laws in Washington. It's supposed to be the Congress, but we know the courts overstep their grounds and their views, and they write laws. But what about the overstepping of their rights in the executive branch? Through the issuing of executive orders. It is the executive order that has given, supposedly, authority to the president to assassinate American citizens. Not too long ago, he used an executive order to renew the Defense Production Act, which was written in the 1950s, which is the emergency powers for a president in time of war to take over everything. Socialize the country. But he renewed it with an executive order, but he changed it just a little bit. This executive power that has supposedly been given to the president to declare this emergency in time of war, he changed it and said in times of peace as well. So I would suggest the quickest way to reverse this trend, and I believe it's completely constitutional, is we don't have to wait for legislative action. We need a constitutional president who will use the executive order in a proper manner to repeal all the executive orders that were misplaced in this country. An executive order written back in 1973. Not too many people have talked about this, and they might not think it's too important. I happen to think it was very important. Unfortunately, or characteristically, maybe it was executed by a Republican president in 1973. And they established the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. That is a totally unconstitutional
the government ships the drugs in!
And just last week, I imagine many of you saw, there was a drug bust. They don't know what they were doing. They were suspected of using something a lot safer than alcohol.
Yeah!
But there was a SWAT team that went in and grabbed 7 young people on the campus of UC at San Diego.
Yeah.
And they threw them all in jail, and then after they sorted out the paperwork, they released 6, and they just forgot about one person.
5 days.
And allowed this person to be in prison 5 days, no water, no food, and he was in critical condition, and he was in intensive care for 3 days, and he's going to survive. But then the question is, who's liable for that? Because there's a lawsuit filed, and I think a lawsuit is proper. And there should be a compensation. But I've always had a little trouble with those type of compensations being thrown back on the people. So why shouldn't it be, when people are acting outside the law, outside the Constitution, those individuals who committed those acts that were illegal, why shouldn't they be personally liable for the corruption? Now, a few years ago, when the TSA got even more abusive, I introduced legislation along those lines. Of course, the best way to have taken care of the TSA was to vote against the establishment of the TSA to begin with, and to have voted against the Patriot Act, which gave them so much authority. But my suggestion in this legislation was that a TSA agent can do nothing that you can't do. So if you can't grope a stranger and you go to prison, if anybody at the airport gropes a stranger and he pretends he's allowed to because he belongs to the government, he should be personally liable and suffer the consequences. It is a shame that our government here in Texas didn't stand up stronger against the TSA. But let me tell you, there is another vehicle, and it's going to be used ultimately, and they're starting to use it. And that is nullification. The nullification has not been used throughout our history, but it was understood and was assumed to be a proper procedure where the states just ignore the feds when they come in and try to enforce illegal laws. But there are 2 states now, I believe it's Virginia and Arizona, they have passed, in a way, a nullification law about not supporting the military when they come in under the National Defense Authorization Act and arrest an American citizen, that they will not participate in those arrests. There is still this danger of how many federal policemen are carrying guns now. Before the TSA, I had a number, it was close to 100,000, so it must be much bigger now. As far as I'm concerned, under the way the Constitution was written, there was not to be any national police force. There was to be a defense force defending against enemies, but not to have a national police force coming in. But 100,000 plus now who come in to enforce regulations that are technically illegal, that all should be canceled out. We say no more of this. We want to take care of our own business and get the feds out of our lives and out of their Everybody knows that we're in an economic crisis, a lot worse in other places than Texas. And one time a few months ago, somebody asked me in the media, they said, who are you running against? And what one individual are you running against? I think they wanted me to say, you know, that 100% of our problems came from Obama, and I didn't yield to their temptation to say that, even though he's responsible for an awful lot of mess we have. No, I said, the one individual I'm running against is Keynes. Some people understood it and some people didn't understand it. But guess what? I'm getting to debate Keynes through his apostle, Paul Krugman. And that is an important subject. A true revolution has to be ideological. Revolutions can be violent and they can overthrow government and nothing really improves. An ideologically positive revolution is what is necessary. And that's what we have going in this country. It is really very positive. has been laid, just as the groundwork was laid before our first revolution. And there was a clear understanding about what freedom was all about, what sound money was all about, and that's why they wrote a good document, the best probably in the world, although it was obviously flawed because we ended up not living up to that document. But at least there was an intellectual movement before that, as there has been now for several decades. But what I have noticed, since I've been involved in this since the 1970s, what I have noticed in the last 5 years, all of a sudden the revolution has gone mainstream. The people are waking up.
The people are waking up.
And they're understanding, that the Keynesian argument, the big government argument, is we get into trouble, which they recognize that, we spend too much, we borrow too much, we regulate too much, we print too much, and then we get into a predictable crisis. And what do they say? Well, we haven't spent enough, we haven't borrowed enough, we haven't printed enough money. Then they wonder why the solution hasn't come. I believe and I'm convinced by free market economics that wealth comes from work and savings. Therefore, you don't want the government to spend our resources, whether it's direct taxation or indirect through the dilution value of your money. So my suggestion in our first year will be to cut the budget in real terms by $1 trillion. In some ways, I empathize a little bit with Paul Ryan because he is offering token cuts over the proposed increases over the next 10 years, and he gets nothing but grief that he's going to destroy everybody because he's made these cuts. But he hasn't really made any cuts. The budget is to go up about $10 trillion automatically over the next 10 years. So if you cut $2 trillion out of the proposed increase and you still spend an additional $8 trillion, there are no cuts whatsoever. So this is a pretense. So you have to cut. And you say, people get worried. Where are you going to cut $1 trillion? Well, where's the budget? What will happen? I said, well, we're not cutting the spending. We're just deciding the people can spend the $1 trillion, not the bureaucrats and the politicians. People still worry, and they believe that this will make our economy weaker if the government isn't spending this money. But that is not true. Because obviously the people are going to spend their money more wisely. But in order to cut, I don't believe in this idea, although we talk about it and occasionally we have legislation that I give token support for, and that is get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. As if it's the wastefulness of the government program. No, it's the government program per se. It's the taxing program of the government per se. It's the policy. It's the policy that has to change. This entitlement mentality and this foreign policy has to change. That's what we're doing. There's no reason in the world why we shouldn't be able to bring people together on foreign expenditures. Left, right, center, independents, progressives, whatever. We ought to be able to come together because we're running out of money, the people are suffering, and we don't need to bleed ourselves anymore by spending more money overseas. But people will say, well, who's going to be the policeman of the world? Who's going to do this and that? And who's going to do the nation building? I would say, not the USA. Foreign policy that has been around for many, many years and has actually gotten must words. It's been endorsed by Republicans and Democrats. It's the foreign policy of interventionism, of trying to tell other people what to do. But just go back, all the way back to the year 2000. How do you think the Republicans did a good job on electing a president on a foreign policy that said no nation building, no policing of the world, and have a humble foreign policy? That was pretty good advice. Too bad we didn't live up to it. So no, a non-interventionist foreign policy provides a stronger national defense. You only go to war when the Congress declares the war and not at the whims of the president. Now there are executive orders that are very proper by the president. The executive orders to move the troops around. So a constitutional non-interventionist foreign policy president can use the executive orders to stop the wars and bring the troops home. It hasn't been a very wise foreign policy, and it hasn't been a fair trade-off. We lost 3,000 people on 9/11. We went the wrong way. The American people got immediately punished by having the Fourth Amendment repealed and having passed the Patriot Act. How much more sacrifice did we participate in? Over 8,000 Americans have died. 42,000 Americans have come back with serious problems and injuries and amputations. Hundreds of thousands looking for help for psychological reasons, post-traumatic stress syndrome and head injuries, and they're not even getting their help. How much more of this payback can we afford? I would say that we have to wake up and understand foreign policy and understand the warning of the CIA and the Defense Department and other intellectuals saying, you know, if you get in their face and you occupy their country, why don't you think about it? What would it be like in Texas if China put their ships offshore and put their troops on our land? We would not be very happy. So this is a place where we ought to come together and join and stop spending. I don't happen to advocate cutting spending for children or adults. We've conditioned so many to be so dependent. It's a poor system. There's a much better way, but there's a way to wean ourselves off. But if we don't clean up this mess, if we don't cut real spending, if we don't restore sound money and free up the marketplace and come to a sensible agreement on foreign policy, this thing is going to end badly. The money is going to be destroyed, and that means high interest rates, higher cost of living, and everybody's going to suffer. There will be the more money you print to send it out to help people with medical care, the worse it will be. Yeah. So this is a time where we have to make the decision. And also the main reason why I've talked so much about monetary policy. Monetary policy and the Federal Reserve are the facilitators. They tax money and they also buy up debt. They perpetuate the debt. We have a system based on debt. The more the politicians spend to give the people stuff, the more they get elected, and they take these treasury bills, they put them in the Federal Reserve, they call them an asset. In the old days they had gold and silver. Now the more you spend, the more debt you have, the more assets, the more money they print. It's a suicidal course. It won't work, and we're approaching that end. And the government lies to us about the amount of unemployment, and they lie to us about the amount of destruction of the currency. People in the middle class are getting poorer. The country is shrinking in size as far as the middle class goes. There's not been really significant economic growth since the year 2000. And people know it. They know there's something wrong, but you cannot produce wealth by the Federal Reserve creating money. And when they do it in secret, guess what? The special interests get the benefits, the ones that have already been benefiting. So when the crisis hits, the Congress and the Federal Reserve rushes to bail out Wall Streets and the banks and the Goldman Sachs of the world. That is a very good idea. The Fed, like I say, is a facilitator. The Fed will end when we restore liberty in this country and when we restore the rule of law and believe in our Constitution. There is no authority for a central bank nor paper money in our Constitution. But the basic thing that we have to understand is, what is personal liberty all about? We know what Jefferson thought about it. It was a God-given right to our life and our liberty, and it should be a God-given right to keep everything we earn. But 100 years ago, approximately, freedom was chopped up into two pieces, and because it's divided, it gets whittled away, and that's why we're in this mess. But freedom for the individual means that you have personal liberty. You have your religious liberties, you have your intellectual liberties, but you also should have your liberty to run your personal lives as you want to run your personal lives. That is why you have to endorse this very, very extreme view, and I saw a sign here today, this extreme view that you ought to have the right to drink raw milk if you want. problem with this is one side protected social liberties, the other side tried to protect economic liberties. Neither side have done a very good job. But the freedom movement is now saying we really want to protect economic liberty. We really want to protect personal liberty. We need to put it back together. And guess what happens? All of a sudden you bring people together. Not because we have the same religious views, not because we want to read the same books, and not because we want to practice our social lifestyles the same. Matter of fact, it's exactly the opposite. We come together because we want to protect our freedom of choice, so we should come together for those reasons.
President Paul.
I think a lot of that is happening. We've been very encouraged with what our trip has been in the last month. We've probably been to about 20 campuses, and the low numbers are 2,500, 8,000 sometimes. But we don't know exactly what will come out next week with our primary. We don't know exactly what will come out in August. We think good things will come of it. We don't know what will happen in November, but we do know what is happening in the country and how people are waking up and how many people now endorse the principles of liberty. And like I have said so many times, that, you know, an idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by armies or by the politicians. There is every reason to be optimistic about the way things are going, but not to be complacent. To be complacent means that we wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't be concerned, we wouldn't be trying to get Ted in there to help Rand, and all these things. So there's reason to be optimistic, but it's ideology that is important. The one individual can't do it. You have to have support, and I think this is what's coming. We are changing the hearts and minds of so many people. This reminds me of a story that I frequently use to demonstrate the point about two colonels that got together after the Vietnam War finally ended. I'd been in for 5 years during the 60s, and but in the early 70s, when the war ended, Colonel Harry Summers and Colonel Tu from Vietnam got together to talk about how to pick up some pieces. But our colonel wanted to get the last word in, so when he met Tu, he says, "You have to remember, Colonel, you never defeated us one time on the battlefield." And Colonel Tu paused for a minute. He says, "That is true, but it's also irrelevant." Because people who are defending their homelands, whether it's Vietnam or whether it's Afghanistan, which they've been doing for 1,000 years, the people defending their homeland have the hearts and the minds of the people. Even when they fight among themselves, they will still fight to keep out the invaders. So that is why it's a fruitless fight. But it is this way in this country too. We may lose a battle here and there, but ultimately we're going to win the war, and because we're winning the hearts and minds of the American people. Is that I can't imagine people not wanting to maximize our chances of having peace and prosperity. That should be our goal. It can be achieved in a free society. It is never achieved in a totalitarian society. Yeah! So often the opposition will accuse us going back, like Paul Krugman said the other day, you want to go back 100 years. And no, the authoritarians want to go back 1,000 years and 2,000 years. The dictators and the pharaohs and the kings have been around for a long, long time. Freedom is a new idea. It was really developed in this country. We have lost our way, but we can find our way again, and that is what is happening. Thank you very much.